Okay, I think we get started. Hi everyone, welcome. If a reminder to please sign in to the meeting notes, which I'm pasting into the chat right now. And a reminder that participation in the meeting is an agreement to abide by the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct, which can be found at the top of the meeting notes. If anyone has agenda items, please add them. I mostly want to talk about the 1.0 proposal. So first, it's the first item in the meeting note, and I guess I'll present real quick. So we talked about this in previous meeting. There's a conversion of the 1.0 proposal doc that this group has reviewed to Markdown. Asked folks to review it. I have 2 LGTMs so far. Since I haven't heard anything, I'll submit it by the end of the day. So just a last chance to comment on before submitted. Could always make further pull requests to change it if needed, but I just want to let folks know. Second topic, I wanted to present just to give an update on some changes I've been making. It's not really ready for review per se, but I just want to not have like silence for weeks on end. I have a, let me share the screen. Okay, can you hear me now? I think so. Yes, okay. All right, thanks, Peter. I find the Zoom interface confusing every time. So this is the only page I've updated so far. It tries to incorporate the main high-level feedback that we've wanting to address for 1.0, namely explaining at a higher level what the levels are, explaining why we're doing it, and what the security, what the benefits are, and kind of give a more clear progression. I think I won't read through the text. Again, I'll send out a proper pull request later once I've cleaned up a lot of these to-dos. But I have like a little bit expanded intro, a summary of the levels with requirements and benefits, some notion of key principles that so far have been unstated, but we've talked about a lot verbally and in comments around like automatically verifying artifacts, but manually verifying systems, scalable verification, etc. I don't know if that should go in this page or a different page. The main thing is this build track page where I talk about kind of what each level means, who it's intended for, what are the actual requirements, and why one would want to do that. And so the basic idea is to give people a clear guidance for like, who are these levels for? How would I go about doing them? Why would I do them? I think there's still further work to do here. In particular, we talked about breaking up requirements between like what the project maintainer should do versus like an implementer of a build system should do. That I haven't incorporated yet. But I'm hoping that this type of layout will be a little bit easier to read. Again, if you're interested in looking at a preview version, you could click on the link in the meeting notes. And I'm going to hopefully have this within a day or two to send out for actual review. Again, chopping out a lot of the to-dos. Maybe one thing that's worth asking now, like before kind of wordsmithing the text, is on this summary of levels. I tried to incorporate the notion that it's not just like just publishing provenance is not sufficient, that you need to actually do something with it or else you don't actually get any of the benefits. Like you don't prevent any attacks if you publish provenance and then it just gets deleted, for example, or used. So some downstream system actually has to do something with it to make some sort of impact. So I tried to include that in the wording. So at build level 1, evidence that the package was built as expected or documented, which would incorporate the notion like not just that it exists, but that also there's some sort of expectation of what it should look like, and you're comparing to that. And then at level 2, we add signing and the hosted build service, and then 3 is further hardening. I guess, and is there any initial thoughts on that? Like, oh no, that like, yes, that's good, or no, that's terrible.
So L1 says, I expect evidence that the package is built in a particular way from a particular source.
That's what I'm saying here, which is a bit of a change from the previous. It's not just a wording change, but is a different, it's kind of a requirements change too. Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think generally this looks good. I'm just trying to think of some of the, and we can figure out some of the wording, but I know that there's, what's the term for it where, I think we just need to make it clear that it should be considered an affirmative thing. Like lack of SLSA evidence doesn't necessarily mean anything. If that makes sense, like for example, I think with what we were talking about with like L1, right, is if you are trying to think of how to word this, but it's like this thing here of, you know, L1 is a start. Obviously, it's not signed, yada yada, and I think you did a pretty good job there explaining that it could be incomplete. But I think the thing that we just need to make sure is that incompleteness should not be an assertion that you actually did something correct. It should be only used as we don't know.
I don't think I follow, but maybe
I think
include on that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to think of I'm forgetting the actual term for it, but it's like a positive assertion. Like so, at L1, right? Or even in some of the other ones, I'm trying to think of the right way to explain it. It's like,
you mean like lack of evidence is not evidence of a lack or something?
Yeah. It's like absence of evidence is not proof that it doesn't. Yeah.
Well, if I may, as I understood L1 beforehand, it was just the ability to generate some type of provenance attestation, not necessarily the actual evidence of provenance attestation, right? I mean, so the ability to be able to generate that alone was sufficient for L1. I mean, I'm saying if this is changed, great. I'm just saying that the ability to provide it, not necessarily the absence of, doesn't necessarily detract from being a level 1, but the ability to generate provenance attestation is sufficient for L1. So and I'm just giving a caveat to what Mike is saying. I mean, I don't, the lack of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have L1 if you're able to generate said evidence.
Yeah, and to clarify, there's I think two, other than like a rewrite, you know, like refactoring, I think there's two main content changes here that I'm just kind of like previewing for this group to discuss now. And we could actually, I think once you actually read the thing, I think that's a better way to form an opinion. But one is like including the switch to the term evidence, where like provenance attestation is the form of the evidence. Because when I was writing this original table up here, saying provenance exists or something like that, it kind of raised the question of like, beg the question of why is it value? Whereas I think evidence is a little bit more self-explanatory, or I'm hoping that was the thought process. And two, that it would require, and this is a big change, and that we really need to discuss. At level 1, we not just produce provenance, but you also have some expectation of what that provenance should look like. And I think I said it down here. Like how is it expected to be, like the source repository and a build command, and that you actually check it against that. So that these two are the big changes from the status quo. Marcella?
Yeah, I might be echoing what some of the other folks are saying. I think for me, I'm having a bit of a hard time with the word evidence itself, because we also have this notion of providing evidence for the claimed like metadata, right? For higher provenance levels. And so I'm wondering if the word evidence might be a bit misleading. What I'm trying to say, I guess, and are we really providing evidence, or is it really just claims of this was built in a certain way, or assertions, or maybe I'm being a bit of a language stickler, but if we are using evidence to mean something else in other levels, then maybe we should disambiguate, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's I think a very good point. So like one way to change it would be to just say, like, for example, attestation that the package was built as expected.
Yeah.
My thinking was that if we try to think about this from like an outcome perspective, like what are we actually trying to achieve here? I think like, well, one, we have to be careful about wording, because it's not just an attestation that the package was built, but more of like that we checked that there was some sort of attestation and it was actually built the way it was supposed to be built. Okay. All right. Maybe we should. Well, it's up to you if you want to spend more time on it. I could also think. I'll try to incorporate that more in the draft, and then we could also think about it when we actually send the pull request. But it sounds like evidence is maybe not the best term, because we don't use it elsewhere, and when we do use it elsewhere, we usually mean something else. Any thoughts on like this notion that there is some sort of expectation? It's what Vita and I had called policy before, but that term is overloaded, and so I'm just trying to avoid that term. That there's some sort of expectation of how it should be built, like all versions of the package should be built, or future versions of the package should be built, and that you verify it against that. So it's not just change your build system and you're done, but there needs to be some sort of notion of what correct is. And it's not here, I don't know where to stick it, but correct could be an explicit writing down of like, it's supposed to be built from this source. Or it could be implicit of like all prior versions were built this way, so I expect future versions to be built that way too.
Mark, are you referring to The check being done by the publisher or the check being done by the receiver?
I was trying, so I had like a little thing saying it's kind of implementation dependent, upload unused. Maybe I should say who does it too. I was thinking that this would be unopinionated about that, that like you could claim to do SLSA in either case. Like if you do it at upload time, for example, if this is, let's pretend we're doing this for the NPM open source ecosystem, like NPM doing it upload time, or the NPM client at install time, or even some sort of monitoring. Like just the fact that the check happens seems valuable. Although maybe that almost implies that should be a different, it's almost orthogonal of like whether it was actually enforced or not. Or like, does it generate a warning? Does it actually block the uploads? Does it just send an after the fact notification?
Yeah, there's the issue also, who provides this expectation. We could maybe discuss that offline if it takes too much time.
Yeah, I was thinking for the, who provides it, maybe this wording is too prescriptive, but I feel like the package maintainer is the only one that really knows that like I as a user have to just trust whatever the package maintainer says. Like if they say it's going to be built from this source, then it doesn't make sense for me to expect it to be built from some other source. Like I can't get them to do that. Okay. So anyway, I'll share this. I want to see that thought in people's heads in case that you think about it further and they're like, yes, I like this idea, or no, I hate this idea. If you have an opinion at all, before like the full thing goes out. And I'll have to figure out how to break this up because I would ideally like to separate like this, the actual requirements change in a separate pull request from just the write-up change that doesn't change requirements. So I'll figure out how to like do some sort of ordering there. But I'm basically trying to do what I want to look like final version, and I'll chunk it up. Another topic I'd like along the same lines that I'd like to discuss is issue 498, which I filed last week. Just share my whole window. In the current version of the spec, we have this scripted build requirement at level 1, which says all build steps are fully defined some sort of build script, and the only command manual is to invoke the build script. And it talks about like running via makefile or like GitHub Actions. When writing this, I was coming from the perspective of like, how can I summarize what the point of each level was? And I think the point of level 1 is that you just have provenance and you check provenance. And the build script piece kind of felt weird. I couldn't really explain why it existed or what benefit it's adding to that level. And so I thought, is it really buying us anything if we chop it out so that way it's not listed as a requirement here? It effectively gets required at the next level because any sort of automated system, you have to give it the commands to automate. And so at level 1, if the provenance describes, if we're saying it has to say how it was built, what's the difference, basically? And so I want to see if anyone has opinions on removing that requirement.
And move it to a different level, or just removing?
I would remove the requirement in like this table, assuming we keep a table that looks like this. I would just remove this thing entirely because it's I think it's implicit.
Yeah, hey,
at
Mark,
level 2.
this is Gilbert. I did think about this a while ago. My only question is, do you want to address do you want to track the repeatability of that build script? Or any script in general? Is that the goal? If the repeatability, or some sort of tracking the repeatability, the provenance of that repeatability and where it's stored?
Do you mean the purpose of the original purpose of having this here, or the purpose now of removing it?
The both, right? So what was the purpose of having a build script inside the build process? I understand it why, but trying to understand.
Yeah,
I mean, it is implied to a degree, but in the real world, right? We all build something, we leave a company, and then that script either does exist somewhere or doesn't exist somewhere. That's what I'm trying to understand.
yeah, so as I recall, the original genesis of this was that we didn't have a level 1. We just started with level 2 was the original level 1. And we thought that, in the very early reviews, like that was too big of a jump to go straight to level 2, like make people go to build service, and that generating provenance would be a good first step because it's like low barrier to entry. We want to make it as low barrier as possible. And again, my memory is probably incomplete here. I think this was added, one, as like a stepping stone toward making a build service, thinking that like, well, you're going to have to do these steps anyway, and we could kind of like have part of the way there as like part of the level system. And 2, so that way the thing that's listed in the provenance is like run make, as opposed to run GCC on this file, then run GCC, then run LD, then like tar up this thing, then run this sed script and blah, blah, blah. And if you have some big complicated thing in the provenance, saying like, here's where the actions that were run, when you verify it downstream, it's hard to say like whether that was correct or not. And like if someone either made a mistake or they slipped some malicious command in there, like the downstream systems have no way to verify.
Got it. Understood. So what we have that I can suggest is we have what we call a blueprint. So building and understanding the blueprint at every run count for every time you build something. That's what we call it. And for every blueprint, it spits out every single step of the build process. And that could include a script, that could include a service, it could include anything. I would suggest calling it more of a blueprint on every run count. And if you want to include a script, then that a script isn't part of that. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense to you guys? Or anyone?
So that would be if we kept it, right? Are you saying, Gilbert?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a pre-step, right, from the previous level, that we somehow the user collects the metadata, like you said, evidence, not evidence. I'd call it a scope. My suggestion would be a scope, because then I don't know, again, I don't want to get hung up on the terms here, but some sort of way of you collecting that data so you know that on build time for every run you have an evidence of what was run on that build, and then if some malicious actor came in and inserted code or inserted something, you would, I mean, not necessarily know, but you would have at least a blueprint of and logs.
Alvaro?
Yes, thank you. I do agree of keeping it because I actually work for the Slackware distribution on the RISC-V port. And something very important about Slackware is that we don't have a build system itself. So there is no way that Slackware is going to pass through a level 2. So having this build script in the level 1 is actually a good idea because Slackware only uses something called the Slack build scripts. So if we actually try to make Slackware SLA SLSA compliant, it would actually have to jump from level 1 strict to level 3 for this reason. So yeah.
So my main concerns are mostly have been around if you reach out to the community, there's a lot of folks who are kind of confused between the difference of scripted build versus build as code. And then a little bit of the sort of like how build service comes in. And I'm not 100% sure keep it versus don't keep it. I do think we probably want to maybe take a step back and just say what are the goals here. And to be clear, I think you did a pretty good job at least highlighting some of the problems. But I think that there still is value in making sense of the difference between somebody running commands arbitrarily to make a to run a build versus the build itself versus the build service. So something like the thing that is triggering the build. And there is some minutia there that I think is worth at least making sure it's clear to folks, right? Which is, what is the responsibility of the build service? Because certain folks maybe consider that something like just like CI, where, oh, actually I'm running multiple compilation actions and tying a bunch of different pieces all into some package, which potentially contains multiple downstream build scripts. Build as code scripts. And I think kind of like highlighting whether or not we care or making it clear that we don't care about that, I think is still important, right? Because a lot of folks are going to ask the question of, should I have a SLSA attestation per component or per distributable artifact, or does it matter? And I think the scripted build helped out there a little bit, but I think it was still a little unclear.
Yeah, that's the confusion is what I would like, my concern about, because I don't understand scripted build versus build as code. I think what it might be is what we're trying to get at with build as code is that with build as code, you identify where those things came from. So like, for example, if in Google Cloud Build, for example, which is a build service, you can either upload the client can parse your YAML file on your local machine and send it to the service with like all the commands basically inlined in the request. Effectively, I think it gets uploaded to somewhere, something like that. And the build service says, I was given these commands and I ran them. But you don't know like what what source and what commit those things actually came from, or if they were modified from what was actually checked in. Whereas at level 3 in the current requirements, as I understand it, the idea would be that you could actually tie that back and say, effectively Google Cloud Build would say, I ran the stuff from this commit without like, it might also list the things it ran, but it would tie it back to a specific source. Gilbert?
Yeah. I think you said what I was gonna ask is, do we want to identify the build step that ran in someone's like workstation versus someone, like you said earlier, like you submitted these steps to some build process and that build process looks at it, and that build process could be anything, right? I think somebody earlier, I think Alvaro mentioned they don't have a build service, so how do they track that? So that was kind of I was repeating kind of what you already said, but that's the question, I think.
Yeah, so in a distribution like Slackware, it's kind of like a legacy thing, because let's remember that Slackware was actually the second Linux distribution that existed. And I think it's the first distribution to actually have a build script to create the packages. So since that time, packages have been built by Patrick Folkerty, which is the main developer in the distribution. So we all from the Slackware team, we all try to replicate the building of the packages by hand. And yeah, it's something that completely gets done by hand. There's actually no build system. Um, there's no build images. We don't really do anything that's replicable, but we actually try to replicate it ourselves. So it's something that it's really legacy. So, and because it's a very small project, Patrick actually does the most of the stuff. I don't really see a future where a build system gets implemented, but we're kind of slowly working to it. So, it might happen in the future. Let's see what happens.
So, and Mark and others, correct me if you think I'm wrong. It sounds to me that the goal here of some of these things is the repeatability component. It's the, hey, if I have a build script and I run that build script locally, if I run that build script and give it some inputs, it does a thing, right? And the idea here as well is, if I have a build service that's running the build, it might be generating those inputs to the build scripts and running those things. And the idea should be, there needs to be, or sorry, at higher levels at least, there needs to be some way of tying it back, so that if somebody wants to know what were the actual inputs to the build script, whatever, even if some of that stuff is generated, what were the inputs to then generate that thing, I think is really valuable there, so that somebody who is going in and trying to repeat a build, can go back and run it against the same set of inputs. And the same thing goes at some level to the build service, right? If the build service goes and says, hey, I was triggered with pull this code from this Git repo, spin up this container, and then in that container trigger this makefile, right? Having that information is super valuable. But I also don't, that's where I think it still is confusing to me if the distinction between what actions are happening at the build service versus what actions are happening in something like a makefile or a build.sh, that's where that distinction is really still unclear.
Yeah, I think I like the focus on repeatability. I wonder, tying it back to the previous topic around expectations. What do you think about like the scripted build? I think maybe the purpose that we're trying to get at is we're defining an expectation of how the thing should actually be built. That like you, for example, you run make, or you run this command, or you run this series of commands. But there should be some notion of like what good looks like, so that way other people can do it, and also you know that on any, when you get problems for any individual one, you could compare that to the expectation. So I guess maybe I'd like to think about, should we transform that into the defining of the expectations? Gilbert?
Yeah, what I was going to suggest is maybe the scripted build can be part of a build service, right? Because it goes back to I think Mike mentioned it, or Mark. Yeah, Mike. About the repeatability, right? I always go back to the repeatability because we want to see the history of what happened and who executed what. Not necessarily, I would separate out the parameter input as part of logs and history of, hey, Gilbert submitted these parameters for this build on this script, right? And versus saying, hey, this script was included as part of the build. So those are two separate things in my opinion. But I'd say build script is part of any type of build that could be, I'll call it a sub of a build service. But the build service, so in my my view is that most of us have control over the build, because, or at least those that manage the build service itself within a company, but we don't have control over sometimes the source. We don't have control source code, or we don't have control of libraries coming in that developers use from, let's say, an open source capability. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Hopefully that adds more flavor to the conversation here.
Yeah, I think, in terms of like it being part of the build service, that was my thought as well, that like in practice, when you use any of these services, you have to define some sort of configuration file that says what to do. And so at level 2 and higher, I think this is in practice always going to be satisfied anyway. And so I wonder if like we could just replace this with expectations. Yeah, Arno?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but the question to me is, if we remove the scripted build, okay, what do we lose? We're saying it's the same whether you have a makefile or if you have nothing and just like a bunch of code and you figure it out. That seems a little bit wrong to me. It seems like, the initial motivation was right in saying, if already you have a defined way of building, you're already one step, beyond where you would be otherwise. And I maybe it's contrary to what I'm just saying now, but at the same time, it's like, what is script, right? What qualifies? Because if I have a README that tells me, okay, this is the instruction you need to issue to build, does that qualify? I mean, if I have a Go program, maybe it just say go install. I don't need a script, and I would have a very repeatable outcome anyway.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to suggest, is like if the expectation is around GCC, because it's a single file, like your whole package is a single C file, or Go. Does that satisfy? I would argue yes. it satisfies the intent.
Yeah, so from
Well,
that
the being
point of
the
view,
README
it would need
probably-
to be reworded anyway to say, the fundamental point is that you have clear instructions on how the build is supposed to be done. Whether it's machine process, readable with the make file or a shell script or not, I don't think is really the point.
Yeah, I feel like that's a good example. So I would lean toward that the script is not actually what we want, but rather some sort of reasonable expectation of what to run. Like in a README, you would say, run, again, taking this like a C++ example, like run all these GCC commands and then LD and then tar and sed, and like you wouldn't do that. You would put it in some sort of script in reality. But if it's just a single command, then that would be fine. And so I think, again, it feels like setting the expectation for what correct is. Marcella?
Yeah, I like the connection to the expectations because, yeah, you said the build instructions, however they are documented, would be the expectation for how the build is supposed to run. But that is only one facet of expectations, right? Because expectations are also about how we should be verifying the provenance, right? Like thinking of the sort of policy angle as well. I'm wondering if it would make sense to almost, and I think you maybe already wrote that down, about sort of build instructions versus verification instructions or something like this, and sort of separate out those two requirements. And maybe this gets a little bit too low into the how this would actually be expressed in the provenance metadata itself, but it seems like part of the requirement for build instructions is to have it documented somewhere, whether that's a README or whether that's a makefile. The requirement should be to point to wherever that is documented, I'm suggesting, wherever the instructions are documented. Because I know in Toto, for example, you can sort of define your layout as well, or define those types of information. So is that a valid way to capture that as well?
Yeah, so I would go so far as to say that, like, well, I think in my opinion, like in total layout, yes, that would be, in my opinion, certainly satisfy this. Pointing to a README, so my concern would be like that it should be machine verifiable.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we make sure that like at level 1, we're not trying to prevent tampering or anyone lying, assuming that the tools are doing things correctly and faithfully. That if someone builds from the wrong command or the wrong script, that should be caught. And so simply saying like, I ran this stuff into README would be insufficient unless there's something that actually parses the README and runs those commands, which I'm assuming probably would not exist. So my inclination would be to either have it be some like more explicit. I don't know. Well, I guess I don't know. So this is now kind of coming into like, what is the policy and how do you implement the policy? And I would, in my mind, you could have an explicit policy like an in toto layout saying, the powers that be have declared that this is what good looks like, and this is what the expectations are. I don't know how necessarily that would work in open source. In like first party closed source, like that, I think is a lot more clear because there's like a hierarchy. Like for example, that's what we do at Google. But I think another model would be like an implicit, like a change on trust on first use. Like, so if the expectation is, you know, all the previous versions were built this way, then effectively you're setting the expectation that future versions will be built this way too. And so in my mind, that would also satisfy the requirement. I don't know if anyone's thoughts one way or the other.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, that's starting to make sense. I think the main things from my perspective, this is probably a requirement, a stricter requirement as we get up to a higher level, is sort of like parsing it all out for, trying to think of how to describe it, like also reproducible inputs, you know what I mean, versus reproducible outputs. Like the idea here of being repeatable is that you know at least all the information you need to rerun a build, and in that information should be complete where the inputs are reproducible, as in like you have the hashes of everything that went in and yada yada yada, and there's other like temporal metadata that might mess stuff up there. Because like ideally, right, even if you know that the binary is not reproducible bit for bit, if you have the same inputs, you're able to run the build, you get two different binary outputs, but you can run tests and scans against those two things. And you're like, yep, largely they seem to have created the same outputs. I trust those two build systems, I think is one of the key goals here. And so the other thing that I think, you know, complicates the matter, but we probably don't need to include at a lower level, is at the higher level, we should make sure that it is a requirement that the inputs should be reproducible. Like you should be able to capture literally, and that I know at level 4, and I know we're not pushing for level 4 right now, but it's that sort of dependencies complete, sources, you know, sources included sort of thing, is you can go in and say, great, here is literally the hash of everything I included. Even if those hashes are no longer available, at least I know what was there if I need to go back.
Okay, so I think I have enough from this conversation that we want something for this requirement. And it's worth considering something around like expectations / policy, and also like how you verify it. And so I feel like a next step, I'll try to capture what we discussed here and put it on the bug or the issue. And I feel like the next step would be to actually write it up as a pull request and see what it looks like and see if we like the wording, because you know, in conversations it's always hard because not everyone has the same mental model. So I feel like, do folks agree like we've talked about enough to kind of know what a good next step is? Thanks, Rana. All right. All right, sounds good. We only have a few minutes left. Are there any other topics that folks want to discuss? If not, we could just cut off early. Going once, going twice. Okay, I say we stop here. Thanks everyone. This was super helpful. And again, I'll try to break up the change into reviewable pieces and send it out sometime this week. Thanks everyone. Good talking to you. Bye.
Bye guys.
Bye.